sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
The presence of the others, non-human beings that we come across in our explorations. And what are these? We begin by looking at the Plague Doctor. Now, according to official history, the Plague Doctor was merely a response by the civilization, the societies of the so-called Middle Ages, to respond to the recurring occurrences of the bubonic plague, or the Black Death as they called it. The purpose behind the Plague Doctor was this was some individual who was not a fully trained doctor or was even considered a charlatan, who was contracted by the state to actually help people deal with the plague. Although, in reality, according to official historical accounts, they really didn't help anybody deal with anything. In fact, the only purpose they served with facilitating the government tracking the plague was designating who had actually contracted the plague and who had died from it. So again, another account of a previous government keeping track of who was alive and who was dead, and yet we still have questionable population counts. So, the Plague Doctor was not effective in responding to the plague. It should also be noted that the actual costume came a couple centuries after the original occurrence of the bubonic plague in the 1300s, or however you want to think of the official historical timeline. There's a very disturbing psychological effect with this character. And indeed, from official historical accounts at the time, we often have an almost inhuman appearance to it. And it's this recurring theme of the inhuman appearance that we have to question, is there something more behind this Plague Doctor? For example, we notice the details in the hands. Very inhuman hands that are often displayed with long nails or something that seems to be some sort of predatory creature. There's always the bird-like mask, and yet we can't ignore the fact that there's even a depiction from Native American lore that matches something that looks like the Plague Doctor. Is this merely a coincidence? Or is this also a profound psychological fear that endured in Native American mythology? To this day, we can see this individual that looks just like the Plague Doctor bird mask. Very strange and frightening creature. And yet when we look closely, we see that it's displayed with the same bizarre inhuman hands, with the long claws. So what are we really looking at with this Plague Doctor? Is this really just some human being who wore a bird mask to have pleasant-smelling things within the mask to protect them from the plague? At least that's what the mainstream tells us. It's always interesting how we have these conflicting accounts in terms of the capability of the denizens of a particular time period. And yet the Plague Doctor is no exception. Simply have pleasant-smelling things, and it'll protect you from the plague, the terrifying scourge of the bubonic death that had completely overwhelmed Europe and returned in subsequent centuries. Again, that's what the mainstream historical account says. But we consider the psychological and profound terror that would accompany this mask. Why would any government or religious authority at that time, as we're informed Europe especially had, allow this or condone it? It's almost as though they were trying to terrify their population if this is indeed what happened. Or was this really representing something else? A creature that was not human. A creature that may have once been human but was transformed. Or perhaps some sort of other creature. Certainly not human at all from its inception. And when we compare and contrast the accounts we have of the Plague Doctors from Europe to some of the accounts of the Native American mythology, these are questions we have to ask, because these consistencies are a little too common to simply be ignored and dismissed as mere coincidence. When you look closer at the Plague Doctor, though, you start to understand the psychological effect it has, imagining what may actually be under that mask. What if it's not human at all? What if you're actually looking at some sort of terrifying bird or predatory creature? Something that you could even say resembles a Skeksis from the Dark Crystal franchise. And indeed, you have other images that give the display of the pointed teeth and the predatory tongue that's often displayed from what creatures might actually be under these Plague Doctor masks. And we have a completely different consideration, a completely different series of events that may have transpired. That these masks, these almost chemical protective suits, were actually concealing a very horrific and terrifying creature underneath it. that for some reason, the civilizations at that time continued to remember it, and always the profound psychological effect. Because we have to ask, if the plague doctor was not some sort of terrifying creature, why would the authorities at the time actually have their doctors dress up with such a mentality to terrify the population? Unless in reality, they were these creatures, and they were simply concealing themselves so they could operate within the population to do whatever terrifying thing that they were going to do. And we have a good idea of what that was, because what persists with the rumors of these plague doctors or these terrifying creatures is they were indeed predatory. The population in its collective conscience remembers that death accompanied these creatures wherever they showed up. And it was not merely a coincidence. It's something that was remembered and recorded, and you can find no shortage of examples, not just in European historical accounts, but also in the mythologies of many Native American tribes at how terrifying and horrific these creatures really were. What sort of powers did they have? And why is it that they still endure in our memory to this day? The terrifying implications of seeing the appearance of whatever creature may have really existed under the costume of the plague doctor. And now we go to the Kelly-Hopkinsville Encounter. Oftentimes the whole aspect of aliens is dismissed as being absurd and ludicrous. And yet we have this account of the Kelly-Hopkinsville goblins, not necessarily aliens, and this occurred in the town of Kelly, near Hopkinsville in Kentucky, not very far from Fort Campbell in Tennessee, a major U.S. Army base where the 101st Airborne Division is based. And in the encounter at the isolated Sutton farmhouse, we have an account of these terrifying little goblins that just showed up on this farmhouse. What's a little bit more interesting, though, about this account compared to the usual so-called alien contact accounts is that there seem to be elements of it that are more real. For example, there's no accounts of any missing time. We merely had this unfortunate family in this isolated farm in Kentucky that suddenly encountered these goblins, these creatures that were prowling about their farm. And this, of course, invokes the terror with this account. It should also be noted that local authorities, which did include members of the 101st Airborne Division, did arrive to respond to this incident after this family was terrified through a night by these goblins and tried to fend them off by using firearms. Naturally, the firearms were not effective against these horrific entities, these goblins, or these aliens, whatever you really want to think of them as. And yet the incident afterwards was well documented of the family being terrorized in their own house by these horrific goblins. Repeated attempts to fend them off with firearms were ineffective, and the goblins continued to terrorize the family within and in the exterior of their house and their farm. It should be noted that when the authorities arrived on the scene, they took this account very seriously, and they did notice that the family seemed to be in a state of utter terror and panic, as though they really had endured some sort of event that had challenged their psychological well-being. And one could certainly understand why the presence of ghoulish creatures that are impervious to firearms could inflict such terror on people that they would never forget it. And I think that's one of the elements of this particular account that gives it a little bit more credibility. Of course, we could easily dismiss this account as the product of fantastical imaginations, but the fact that the authorities did respond and did document that this family was psychologically traumatized gives it a little more credibility. It should also be noted that this encounter very nearly inspired a certain filmmaker to make a film about terrifying aliens. Of course, he changed it to more of a cute alien that we recall as E.T. The event was also documented in local media at the time. On this farm in Kelly, Kentucky, where the story of a spaceship and 12 little men showed up on the farm terrorizing the family, and that the firearms were indeed ineffective defending them off. What was really going on? What were these creatures? Were these aliens, as we might like to think, or were these some other extraterrestrial entities beyond which we understand? Or was this some sort of cryptid, some sort of undocumented animal that happened to be existing near this farm? Or was it simply the product of mass hallucination and everyone panicking had caused the family to go into this panic state because they thought they viewed something that was not really there? And when the authorities arrived, therefore they documented it as though it was an event where the family was psychologically traumatized, but it was merely the product of their own crazed imaginations. It should be noted, though, that there is a very profound psychological effect to intrusions within your own property, your own residence. So we could certainly understand why the profound psychological effect could inspire the imagination to hallucinate a little bit. But for whatever reason, there seems to be some more consistencies behind this. Although some would state that it's merely a desire of the state of Kentucky to simply bring about more tourism by pushing this particular area and having people come in to explore the lands that were involved in the great Kelly-Hopkinsville Encounter. Yet, oddly enough, in subsequent events and investigations, there never seemed to be many inconsistencies with the accounts that were given, and no one in the family ever retracted their account as being official. Now, I'm sure if you look a little deeper, you might find potential retractions and changes, or the story going back and forth. But it is a very terrifying and almost realistic seeming story. What were these goblins, if they did in fact exist? Where did they come from? And what was their true intention? Based on the events that the family reported, they just seemed to be curious above all else. And it really was stating the word probing. Probing is a military procedure, or conducting reconnaissance, trying to learn about a particular area. And there might be a follow-on force that's going to follow probing. These are some of the sketches of the creatures, or the goblins, or the entities, or whatever you want to refer to them as, that were cataloged by one of the members of the 101st Airborne when they showed up to investigate this event. Some local authorities even suggested that perhaps the family had misidentified our good friend the owl as these horrific entities. Yes, indeed, and I've certainly encountered a lot of bulletproof owls in my life as well. They're beautiful animals, but somehow I don't believe that these were owls. Either this was some sort of massive psychological aberration for the family, or there was a little bit more to this account. There is a troubling and unsettling element of realism. The fact that this remains a quote-unquote well-documented account, and the fact that no one was ever able to dismiss or disprove this. The actual occurrence of creatures showing up in our home or our isolated residence is a recurring terror that we face. So, do these creatures represent something that are real? Do they have some other explanation? Let's look at the accounts that we have of cryptids, monsters and demons. One of the most well-known that we have tends to be the Jersey Devil, operating in the Pine Barrens Forest in New Jersey. And there have been many different films and books that explore the account of the legend of the birth of this creature, involving elements of witchcraft and myth and several different origin stories, although there tend to be a few agreed upon. The Jersey Devil represents the classic cryptid, a very disgusting and horrific creature that exists in contravention of all known rules of life. And yet there have been several documented sightings of this creature, some images even being purported to be real. Although, of course, we know that with our ability to generate images, this doesn't necessarily prove anything. And again, this could be another example of some sort of psychological aberration. But what interests me is that we have so many different historical accounts, or things that are well documented, that allude to the existence of this terrifying creature, this Jersey Devil. There's also the really strange element of the psychological effects that seem to accompany this creature wherever it exists, or if it does in fact exist. Is this merely the product of the tales impacting the human mind, and suddenly it becomes yet another version of mass hysteria? Well, perhaps the thing we should be most concerned about then is how easily influenced the human mind can be, and perhaps how easily influenced the mind can be in large groups, if that's indeed what we're seeing here as the mainstream wants us to believe, that none of these creatures really exist, and that people are just simply susceptible to, how shall we say, suggestion. But oddly enough, there do seem to be more details behind certain cryptids and creatures such as the Jersey Devil, whether it's the description of its actual being, or some of its terrifying personal habits that it has. What does it hunt? And why does it have such an element of terror to it? Is it possible that such a creature could really exist? We've oftentimes dismissed the other creatures that we said could never exist, and yet we're often surprised at what our mainstream and official accounts tell us about what existed in the distant past, whether it's large creatures or terrifying creatures. This is what the Jersey Devil allegedly looks like, and this is its scale to an actual human. Now, is it true to some of the mythological accounts that the Jersey Devil was the product of some sort of witchcraft, some sort of spell, or maybe even some sort of dark alchemy, if you will? Some sort of experiment that we think about with the homunculus example that may have gone wrong and transformed either some sort of unfortunate creature or human being into something else. Once again, this will simply be dismissed as fantastical accounts or simply searching for possibilities when there are none. It should also be noted that one of the most interesting films made about the Jersey Devil was Exploring for the Jersey Devil, called The Last Broadcast. It set the stage for the found footage films, although this one is a little unique, and it did precede the more famous and well-known Blair Witch film. The other interesting element about this film is it talks about the profound psychological impact on certain individuals. And unlike the Blair Witch, we do actually find out who's behind the killings in this film. And we do find out where the real terror lies. It's within the human heart, or the human soul, or however you want to view it. And perhaps that's the real terror that we have. Other cryptids that we consider are the Mothman from West Virginia. And the Mothman has several different accounts behind it that seem to give it a little bit more realism than we might like to think. Accounts of something being in post-World War II munitions plants, a creature that was roving around there that terrorized several teens as they were driving in their car. There's even an account of a couple teens trying to escape this creature, driving at speeds in excess of 100 miles per hour, and the creature was easily keeping up as it flew. There's also the accounts of the Mothman that say that it would be a portent of doom. Of course, there's always signs and portents that seems to accompany these creatures, whether it's a bridge collapse or some other great calamity that occurs in a particular area. There's many myths that actually come about from Appalachia, where this Mothman was sighted, and many of these myths include other accounts of cryptids. Is there again something more to this, or once again is this a mass psychological aberration? Is this again some sort of creature that may have existed in the distant past, and yet some surviving examples of it, for whatever reason, continue to inhabit the wilderness that are not easily seen? Or again, is it just something that we could easily dismiss as some sort of psychological aberration? Our mainstream adherents will dismiss this as merely the product of pseudoscience, and indeed they try to categorize these sightings as the adherents of pseudoscience simply trying to push a meaning that these are aliens or some other strange cryptid creatures that have never been seen. What I find particularly interesting, though, is in this age of the internet and shared information, that we have such a variety of creatures that are seen all over the land. We don't have people reporting Mothman sightings all over every single continent. We have unique creatures that seem to be confined to unique regions. Now, once again, I'm sure that our mainstream skeptics or skeptoids will tell us that this is merely the product of localized mass hysteria. We also consider the account of the Wendigo, a Native American mythological terror. The Wendigo is quite fascinating because of the fact that it was a spirit, and yet there are diverging accounts that it was either some sort of horrific, monstrous creature, or a spirit that would possess a human being, causing it to engage in cannibalistic tendencies. Indeed, the terror behind these creatures is that they would actually feed exclusively on human flesh. And I've always given a little bit more variety and understanding, along with authenticity, to some of the Native American mythological accounts. They had to go through surviving a lot of factors of the reset to include the reservation in the American education system, and yet they managed to retain many of their myths and their legends, which do seem to have a little bit more in terms of legitimacy to them, especially given the fact that there are numerous Native Americans that will not speak of creatures such as these. The Wendigo is terrifying, though, because of its existential nature of threatening the very flesh of human beings. There's also accounts of the fact that it did persist across the land, and it's such a very powerful memory. And again, it goes back to questioning the whole fact that we have such a vast array and variety of creatures that are seen across the land. So, again, is this merely the product of old myth, old legend that's very regionalized and localized, and we don't see it everywhere? Or is there something that's truly authentic to the presence or the possible presence of these creatures that are very clearly non-human? Or perhaps an even more disturbing possibility that these creatures were once human that were transformed into something that were no longer human by some process that we no longer understand. Indeed, when we look at many of the mythological accounts, the legend, whether we're talking about one of the cryptids, the Wendigo, or even the Plague Doctor, there seem to be accounts that do give a disturbing possibility of what these creatures could possibly afflict in terms of terror on a human population. And this is where we start to see the connections from our other previous explorations when we look at the fall of previous civilizations. We do seem to have it in our collective memory that there were creatures that were quite terrifying, creatures that had tremendous psychological, physical, and even spiritual capabilities to attack and destroy the very welfare, the very fabric of human civilizations in the past. Imagine a vast army or array of such creatures like this. Different types of creatures in different areas that had these extended capabilities. Now, once again, I'm sure the adherents of the mainstream would dismiss such a notion as the product of pseudoscience or just simply a wild imagination. Although, I'm always interested in the fact that we also want to say that there were wondrous and fantastical creatures that did officially exist in the distant past. So why is it some creatures could exist and other creatures cannot? Well, you simply need to turn to someone in authority, someone who has been through the academic system, and they will give you an honest answer. And the last thing you should ever do is trust what you see with your own eyes, or certainly do not come to your own conclusions. But when we look at the mythological terrors that many of these creatures represent, and we see the fact that they endure within our fear in the back of our mind to this day, we can see that there is indeed a lingering and profound psychological effect behind them. And whatever the actual story behind these creatures, if they're simply truly the product of our minds, or do they represent something that did exist and did terrorize us in the past? We also have to ask the question in terms of how long ago this was in the past. It should be noted that the Native Americans do not speak of many of the terrifying elements of their mythology. And whether it's a skinwalker, a Wendigo, or whatever, and there's certainly no shortage of different creatures that appear in Native American mythology that are quite threatening and terrifying, we do have to remember there does seem to be an element of realism to them, in the fact of the impact of the psychological terror that people do not speak of them. Are these creatures simply the product of our nightmares and we simply record them to terrorize others for entertainment purposes? Or is there something behind them that does reflect something that genuinely happened in the past? A memory, if you will, that's locked in our minds. Were these just UFOs or lights, or do they represent something else? We do have many accounts of strange anomalies that do not make a lot of sense, and oftentimes people will go to extreme levels to dismiss anything which is seen and reported. And it's quite fascinating. Yet the same accounts could be used or subverted for misinformation purposes. So we always have to remain cautious and keep open minds and actually come to our own conclusions. We see that there is definitely a theme to make the whole concept of exploring topics such as this ridiculous and absurd. And certain skeptoids and people will tell us that we shouldn't even be considering this. Yet when we go about the land, we do see very interesting remnants of what may have been in the past. We do see odd objects that defy simple explanation. And we do have accounts, even when we look at our official and certified historical account, that simply do not make a lot of sense. So what's the real explanation behind these others, these non-human beings? What were they, and where did they fall in our 5 eras possible timeline? Perhaps the plague doctors really were some sort of terrifying creature that was contrived or created in the distant past using some sort of dark alchemical processes. These were creatures that existed between the resets, and they were unleashed on the population to bring about control. And that's why we still have this mentality of death that accompanies the plague doctors. The cryptids could have been other creatures from even before in the past. A few surviving examples that are still dotted across the land. Of course, it could simply be the product of our imagination, and for some reason these legends endure and people are just simply into entertainment. So simply watch the news and don't question anything, and allow yourself to be told what to think and what's important every day. You certainly have that option. But the plague doctor is something that intrigues me because we're informed that this was a response to the plague at the time. Yet these were the same people who managed to construct the Florence Cathedral. And it should be noted that the Florence Cathedral in Florence, Italy was constructed prior to the Renaissance, and they didn't need an industrial revolution to do it. Of course, we can simply wave it off with our usual intellectual cheetah flips of explaining what happened in the past. But what do you think about all this? Let me know in the comments. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for joining me.